This is the first, at least in my time, of what I hope will be a number of collaborations with the Global Policy Institute and other institutions around USC. We're really fortunate to have a terrific panel today. The subject is really the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we want in particular to ask what relevance does it have? Are there lessons we should learn for our current circumstances, particularly the war in Ukraine? I could spend most of our hour introducing our panelists, but I won't. So let me just say a word about each, and then we'll turn first to Professor Zubok. Vladislav Zubok is a professor of international history at the London School of Economics. He'll join us virtually. I should have said before I do the introductions, there are box lunches for all of us here in the room. We will distribute those after the session, but don't forget to get your box lunch. By all means, get up and get coffee anytime. Professor Zubok is a specialist on Russia, has written several books about the end of the Soviet Union, and we'll talk a lot about the, not a lot, but we'll talk about the interactions between Kennedy and Khrushchev in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Meshkati is one of ours. He's a professor at Viterbi. He does civil and environmental engineering. He's also been a fellow on nuclear safety at the Harvard Belfer Center. He'll really focus on some of the near misses in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then talk about broader issues of accident and misunderstanding, which was obviously a critical worry and topic during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And third panelist is Rob English, our colleague in POIR, who's also I could spend a lot of time introducing. He does environmental studies in addition to worrying about international relations. He's a co-director of the Central European Studies and is the faculty advisor to the Global Policy Institute. He'll take a more geopolitical perspective and talk about the similarities and differences from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the circumstances we find ourselves in today. With that, Professor Zubok, over to you. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. It's a little late in Austria, but thanks for joining us. Over to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks to all organizers and all who attend this conferences. I've been participating in various events related to the Cuban Missile Crisis for a quarter of a century, which is a sign of my age, but also gives me some benefit for longitudinal observation, how both sides, I'm talking about the Americans and the Russians, learned about the crisis. The topic about Kennedy and Khrushchev is exciting, but it's rather well covered. So instead, I want to shift slightly the focus of my brief remarks, is sort of to share some of my observations during those 25 years on how both sides learned. And then I will speak about the Russian side that I think I learned some of the lessons of the crisis, which would probably contribute to today's discussion. So let me start by saying that, of course, the process of learning from the Cuban Missile Crisis was grossly biased in favor of the American side. It is safe to say that it was complete dominance of American literature, studies, thinking in this on this topic, and we, of course, recently we commemorated half a century of the appearance of Graham Allison's *The Essence of Decision*, a monumental book that gave sort of a scientific, scholarly framework to the studies of the crisis. And
Graham would join us. I asked Graham to join us for at least a few minutes, but obviously, with the passing of Ash Carter, things at the Belfer Center and school are
things are difficult. But anyway, it should be remembered that the American side created a whole literature, biographical and scholarly, sort of it was the American community that put the crisis in sort of scholarly language, scholarly frameworks that the Soviets lacked, frankly. I'm saying with confidence because I was a young scholar, who tried to find anything I could in Russian language on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was precious little. Until the joint conferences organized, of course, in the United States, but then American hosts began to invite some Soviet Russian participants, notably Khrushchev's son, Sergei Khrushchev and Mikoyan's son, Sergei Mikoyan. So that process, I think, really set a new modus for the learning on the Soviet-Russian side. And unfortunately, I didn't attend those early conferences, but reading the materials, it was easy to say that the Soviet side, the Soviet participants, added more complexity to the American discussion. We know, of course, that Allison's book revolutionized international relations. It's sort of the main conclusion of this book was the mutual assured destruction does not work automatically. But then, Russian participants showed up, and boy, oh boy, they added so much nuance to that, it was easy to conclude after those conferences that, as Bob McNamara mentioned, after one of those conferences, we survived by chance. In hearing all these hair-raising stories, particularly from the Russians, from the Soviets, how poorly everything was planned, how spontaneous was Khrushchev's decision-making, how everything was improvised in many ways and sloppily executed in some ways, definitely impressed Americans, I should say. So that was the moment of in the 80s when I joined the process as a very young scholar. And this process culminated, I think, in a big conference in Havana in 2002, where a very representative, probably the most representative Soviet delegation came. There were the Cubans, and of course they were Americans. So it was probably around the end of the 80s and the early 90s that you have a convergence between the Soviet story of the Cuban Missile Crisis and American story, with a focus on mistakes, errors, possible reasons for escalations, emotion. And that was very, very fruitful way to talk about the crisis. But then what happened, in my observation, that the treatment of the Cuban Missile Crisis and its study in the United States and in the post-Soviet Russia diverged. There was, of course, a liberal-minded minority that followed the line taken by, Khrushchev's son, Mikoyan's son, who by that time, by the way, moved to the United States. But the majority in the military, in the KGB, and also in the historical community took another approach, took another tack. Suffice to compare the two books that appeared around 2002, 2003. One was the book resulted from the project of access to Soviet archives at the time, and written by co-authors, actually, by Alexander Fursenko and Timothy Naftali. One hell of a gamble. Many, of course, in the audience read this book. It's a fantastic analysis with very rich documentation obtained from the Soviet archives. And the emphasis in the book is on this emotions, details, accidents, contingencies, the role of actors and their somewhat irrational fears, and so on and so forth. Slightly later, one of the co-authors, Alexander Fursenko, published his own book in Russian based on the same amount of Soviet evidence, yet it was a remarkably different book. In a sense, it was a very Soviet book that treated the Anadyr operation, sending missiles to Cuba, as a source of pride for the military and the Soviet state, not an area for reflection, criticism, lesson making, and so on and so forth. Around that same time, I was a witness by chance of a spectacular discussion in Moscow on the Cuban Missile Crisis, where former deputy foreign minister, Soviet foreign minister, Georgy Kornienko, he was a deputy of Andrei Gromyko, took a podium and spoke about the lessons of the crisis. So he took this line of, we should learn together, we should learn the lessons of the crisis. And one of his lessons was that to recognize Soviet mistakes. For instance, he said, we made a mistake of sending our missiles to Cuba and troops to Cuba in secrecy. It should have been done legally. And then, to my astonishment, the entire audience that consisted of veterans of the Anadyr operation, most of the military and the intelligence, exploded in rage. They shouted at him, "It's naive, incredible. Yankees would have never allowed this to happen to us. It must have been only secret operation." So my feeling at the moment was that the majority in the audience didn't want to learn. They just thought we did everything correctly. It was a great operation. We just needed a bit more luck because Americans, caught us red-handed. But if we had been more lucky, we would have pulled it off. So at some point, this trend of not learning or unlearning prevailed in my view. There was something strange and something irrational about it. Stubborn refusal to reassess and adjust. There's a Russian saying, of course, to this matter. Russians often say about their past wars, we heroically overcame difficulties that our sloppiness created. I'm sorry for this joke, but it was some degree of lack of planning, some degree of spontaneity and arrogance of decision making that contributed to the difficulties of the Soviet military. And of course, they needed heroism, all they had, and luck, of course, to overcome those difficulties. I also should say that most recently, around 2021, a colleague of mine in Moscow shared with me information about the military archives of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it was a project to declassify some files from the General Staff Archives. So I shared it with other buffs of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We got reasonably excited about the prospect, and then the war started. So the archives lost partially interest in declassification, but they declassified some stuff. What they refused to declassify, however, and this brings, this is the point that I want to make. They refused to declassify their very thick and probably informative file of investigation that took place inside the GRU and the General Staff in 1963 about what went wrong and why the Americans uncovered the missiles and so on and so forth. So even 70 years later, the military, for some reason I cannot understand, refused to declassify the first and probably the last investigation they themselves did that drew on the crisis materials and tried to formulate some lessons from the crisis. So on the basis of what I've been observing and on the basis of even the current conflict in Ukraine, I would dare to come up with several persistent factors in the Soviet behavior in the Cuban Missile Crisis that, remain persistent. First of all, lack of let's say, no love for scenarios. The decision to send missiles to Cuba, of course, was Khrushchev's. And, it was only later that he put in his memoirs, probably with the help of his son, Sergei, in clear and clean phraseology, what actually he wanted to achieve by sending missiles. We would search in vain for the paper trail in the Kremlin archives where that was put on paper at the time, because it was not done in this way. The colleagues of Khrushchev, of course, took it as the ultimate truth coming from the general secretary of the party. They didn't discuss this question, and only later they looked at him with a reproach when Kennedy announced his quarantine, as if they wanted to tell him, you put us into this mess, now you should pull us out of this mess. That's not a good recipe for any collective discussion, so nothing even remotely comparable to XCOM, and nothing that we have in writing to this day. The careless, irresponsible Soviet style of decision-making, maybe it's also Russian. Actually, this phrase, careless, irresponsible Soviet style, is not about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I found this citation It's a citation of a Bolshevik propaganda chief in 1922, 40 years before the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were many examples that he showed in his article, how sloppy are Soviet bureaucrats, how irresponsible are Soviet officials, and why it is so. It is cultural. Is it because, we still have not overcome the bad traditions of Tsarist Russia and so on and so forth. But decades went by, the same persistent factors remained, including that careless, irresponsible Soviet style. So when we look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, we see many traces of this careless, irresponsible style. Lack of proper reconnaissance vis-a-vis Cuba in what, for instance, you can do with the missiles there. There's a story shared with me in 2002 by ex-KGB General Leonov, who of course was a friend of Che Guevara and took active participation in the whole story in 1961-62. So Leonov told me at the conference in Havana why Soviet missiles ended up in Cuba, and the Soviet leadership thought that those missiles would be well camouflaged and would not be uncovered by the Americans. Leonov said, there was a discussion between all the military and the political leadership after Marshal Beryuzov returned from Cuba, and Beryuzov was the head of Soviet strategic rocket forces. And he assured Khrushchev, in the presence of the rest of the military, that it would be absolutely easy and possible to conceal the missile base under the palm trees. So there was, of course, other military, including the military attaché in Cuba, that thought otherwise and tried to raise a voice. But as Leonov told me, the marshal stepped on this military foot under the table, basically tell him, shut up, not a word more. Because the military obviously wanted their base in Cuba, and they just resorted to a typical Soviet, maybe even Russian, practice of pulling the wool over the ears of the bosses, basically telling the bosses everything will be all right, although it was far from so.
Can we wrap up in just a minute or so?
Yes.
Thank you.
We find the same carelessness in in the orders of the battle, in the orders to use nuclear weapons. We know that the first version of delegating nuclear authorities in Cuba to Issa Pliyev was unsigned, of course, order, but it was a bad mistake. And somebody in the audience in the Kremlin noticed it, and it was corrected at the last minute. So it was also irrational secrecy that had a blowback effect on the Soviets themselves. So to conclude my observations, I think we have to recognize that there was not only irrationality involved in the crisis itself. There is an irrationality, pride, and unwillingness to learn, particularly on the Soviet side, on the Soviet side of the Russian military and the Russian security services, that unfortunately became a culture in itself. And we see how this culture translates into the current actions in Ukraine as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's what a great start. I'm told that Hans Blix is also on the Zoom. So Hans, maybe later we can get a quick comment from you, if you're willing. That would be great. But now to Professor Meshkati. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. I have a few PowerPoints to share, and it's really an honor and privilege for me to present this while Dr. Hans Blix, who is a mentor, a great friend, and a great statesman, joining us. Dr. Blix, this is my honor to present, and you listening to me, including other distinguished colleagues here present here and on Zoom. Let me share my screen and see if I could go to my.
Can we do about 10 minutes for that?
Sure.
Thank you.
I will do.
Want to have time for some conversation.
Okay. This is me and Najmedin. What I would like to talk with you is about an unsung hero in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we hear about President Kennedy, Prime Minister Khrushchev, or Premier Khrushchev, but I think the subtitle, "The Man Who Saved the World," really fits with this person. First, I would like to tell you where do I come from. Sometimes I feel like a bull in a china shop in this distinguished international relations. And I'm coming from engineering school, Viterbi School of Engineering. My research for the last 35 years has been in the area of complex system safety, human error, and that. I have been to 3 Mile Island nuclear plant. I've studied 3 Mile Island accident on March 1979. I have been to Chernobyl. I have spent a lot of time understanding the root causes of accident of Chernobyl on April 26, 86. And I have been to, again, these are Chernobyl control of reactor number 3. It was operational. And I've been to Fukushima. Yours truly is in Tyvek suit and face mask. I have visited this, I have seen that, and it's not a fiction, what I'm talking with you about the role of human operators as causing the accidents and preventing disasters, both. And I've been there, I've seen there, I've been to the basement of this is Fukushima Daini, which didn't have meltdown. That's what we were able to get to the bottom of the reactor because this was a boiling water reactor. The rods are inserted from bottom. Okay, this, what I have learned in the last 35 years, this is my understanding and premise. Human operators always constitute the first layer of defense and the last barrier before a disaster. This is the story that I learned from my experience working on that. Now, let me tell you why I learned about Cuban Missile Crisis and why I think it's my understanding and research is related to that. This is our unsung hero, Vasily Arkhipov. Vasily was the commander of the 4 Soviet diesel submarines that they went to Cuba. These 4, they were 4 diesel. Diesel submarines are notorious with the smell of the diesel fuel in that, with the acid for the batteries that they have. What I hear from many people, you don't want to even spend 1 hour in diesel submarine. They sent this diesel submarine because a year before that, one of the Soviet nuclear submarine, which was under command of Vasily, had a reactor meltdown. Several people died, and he got radiation poisoning. That's what it caused his death later on with kidney cancer. He was a hero in extinguishing that fire and saving that submarine. But all Soviet nuclear submarines were grounded. In 1961, that's what in 1962, they set this Soviet diesel submarine. These diesel submarines were designed for the cold water, Arctic water. They were not designed for the hot water near Cuba. That was also another causing problem. Another thing that I learned in my research, always an accident is called an error with sad consequences. The errors are committed by decision makers, by managers, by ministers, and Dr. Zubok gave me a very good line: careless and irresponsible decision making. Sending these 4 diesel submarines, that long voyage, and they were in a deep secrecy. Even they didn't know what were doing so. The commander, the captain of this B-59 submarine that Vasily Arkhipov was in, that he didn't know the mission. He had to open the sealed envelope 50 miles away from the port and learn that going to Cuba. That sending them diesel submarine to that hot water they didn't know even that they have a nuclear torpedo weapon. They call that a special weapon. They didn't know, the crew didn't know that one of their 22 torpedoes are a nuclear tip torpedo. I became very interested in that after I studied Chernobyl accident and Challenger accident. This was a cartoon in Newsweek magazine that I clipped, and as you see, the aging process has made it fade. It says, think about Chernobyl explosion caused by human error. Think about Challenger. Remember, the Challenger happened in January 1986. This thing was published in September 86. I don't know about you, but I'm worried. But remember, this thing came before the declassification of a lot of this Soviet material that I learned about Vasily Arkhipov. This thing happened in October 1962. For many years, until I know around 1997, that all this information was classified. Nobody knew, at least I didn't know about Vasily Arkhipov. Then there was another accident happened, which was an accidental shooting. That is USS Vincennes in Persian Gulf in July 1988, that shot down Iran Air. I studied that. I found my old folder that this is that special issue of the one that you see over here. I had to pull the Freedom of Information Act to get the report of this accidental shooting. A lot of things that went on in this Aegis thing was what happened in the Soviet submarine. Then I had a chance in 2006 or so to be aboard of a USS Jefferson City, which is fast attack nuclear submarine of United States. I spent almost 24 hours in this. They gave me a very nice certificate for that. As you see, being in a submarine, ladies and gentlemen, is just that if you live in your car engine. You're working and living inside your car engine. The living compartment is not a living compartment. What I saw in this nuclear submarine, particularly the code that the mariners, they were putting under the torpedo tubes, under the torpedo, the distance of this and slipping there was quite phenomenal. Just think about that if you live in your car engine. This is what a submarine is. And these are some other photos of that. This is a typical compartment. These photos were taken by official Navy photographer. As you see that there is a little workstation over there, and these are all equipment and that. The person sits over here and work. Again, just imagine that you're working your car engine. That's it. And then this article came that opened my eyes in Financial Times 2002 on the 40th anniversary of that. In this article, they talk about this Soviet submariner, Vasily Arkhipov. This is the photo of that submarine, which was surface of the coast of Cuba. Remember, these are diesel submarines. For them to charge their battery, they need to surface. Unlike the strategic nuclear sub that they could stay underwater for many, many months. They have to surface after a few days. And the condition was miserable in this nuclear submarine when they surfaced. They were chased by United States Navy. They were subject to the depth charges, sonic charges, everything. And they had this special weapon. Remember that only few people, 2 people, they knew what was it. And this is, by the way, when this is actual Vasily Arkhipov B-59 submarine. This is a US Navy helicopter over there that they spotted that, and the whole flotilla, a nuclear power aircraft carrier Randolph and other Corey, they jumped on that. This is again another photo from the US Navy. Okay, there is a book that came out last year that is a seminal book by my colleague and friend, Professor Sergei Polochi from Harvard, that I think is one of the most updated, because he's Ukrainian also, and he had access to a lot of the classified thing. And a lot of my stuff is based on what he said over there. Let's look at some noteworthy facts. And now you realize why Vasily Arkhipov saved the world with his decision. One out of the 22 torpedoes was a nuclear tipped torpedo. And it had a destructive power of almost 2/3 of Hiroshima bomb. They could communicate with Moscow while they were on surface. While they were in the underwater, they could not communicate. Basically, they were in total information darkness. The temperature in the compartment was 45 to 50 degrees Celsius. And in some areas, they were 60 degrees Celsius. 100 degrees Celsius is boiling point for water, just I would remember. Just remember. Think about the working condition in that submarine. The stuffy atmosphere, the problem with the carbon dioxide, and many people, they got passed out. This is the working condition of the submarine that Vasily Arkhipov was one of the senior officers. And then they had to surface, they were under subject to all depth charges and that. They all thought that the World War III has started. And they had a nuclear tipped submarine. They wanted to use it. And as it says, that the commander of the captain of the submarine, Captain Valentin Savitsky, said, let's use it. And they were about to launch it. And Savitsky was ready to launch his thing. And however, Arkhipov, there is a little different story in the book by Sergei Polokhid and the other account that you may have seen that. I can go over that during question and answer, but it was Arkhipov that stopped the fire. One man stopped the World War III. I always remember this last quote from George Santayana, that those who ignore history are forced to relive it. The current nuclear standoff between Russia and US, Mr. Putin threat of using a strategic tactical nuclear weapon, the standoff in Black Sea between Russian Navy and Air Force and United Kingdom that happened 2 weeks ago. That tells us that we need really to learn lesson from what Arkhipov did. It was only one man that prevented World War III. And that was Vasily Arkhipov, our unsung hero. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Wow, wow. Rob, over to you.
Okay, I'm going to come at this from a slightly different angle, and some observations about how the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the possibilities of nuclear use or nuclear escalation are being discussed primarily by American and other Western experts. And I think at the outset, the first thing that strikes me is we see the same kind of division, a kind of bipolar split that we've seen in all discussions of the possibilities of escalation, whether it was the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, the Mideast crisis in '73, or some of the late Cold War crises in '83, '84, when I was inside the Pentagon. Bipolar in the one group, we could call them the hawks, are concerned that if we're too timid, we're simply giving in to nuclear blackmail. The other group worries that the crisis could spin out of control and we could stumble into nuclear war, so we must be very cautious. One group, the hawks again, says the chances are really very small that Russia would actually use nuclear weapons, so we should be bolder in supporting Ukraine's counteroffensives. The other group says that even if the chances of nuclear risks of nuclear use are small, the consequences would be so grave that we just can't risk it. One group is sure that Putin is rational, not suicidal. The other group is not so sure about Putin, but in any case is less worried about the calculated use of nuclear weapons and more about misunderstanding or accident. And this observation leads to my second point, which is that today's situation, in some respects, may be considerably more complicated than was the US-Soviet confrontation over Cuba exactly 60 years ago. And it may be that the chances of misunderstanding or accident are actually greater. Then we had two main actors, the US and the USSR. Today we have Russia, Ukraine, but also the US and other NATO countries. Then we had a confrontation over completing or withdrawing a deployment of missiles in Cuba. Today we have the more dynamic and unpredictable situation of a major war, a direct war between Russia and Ukraine, but also a proxy war with the US and NATO. several of whose states are in the conflict zone. They border Ukraine. Then the situation was complex enough with things like intelligence overflights or anti-submarine hunts, in addition to the main naval embargo, the main naval confrontation on the seas. Today, we not only have active conflict along a front of over 1,000 kilometers, we also have Russian strikes deep into Ukrainian territory on civilian targets. We have some Ukrainian strikes deep into Russian-held territory, like Crimea, or on bases or depots in bordering regions, but upon Russia proper. We also have suicide drones and weapons that strike with virtually no warning. We have assassinations of political and military leaders, sabotage strikes on bridges and pipelines. And we have Europe's largest nuclear power complex right in the middle of that complex of the combat zone. So these complexities of the Ukraine war greatly increase the chances of accident, miscalculation, or overreaction. The point here is that analyses that focus on the simple question of, is Putin bluffing or not? Is he rational or suicidal? Can we safely ignore his nuclear saber rattling? Essentially embrace the simple logic of a linear or binary confrontation, of a war game with one encounter only. Like Thomas Schelling's classic game of chicken, that model, or the politics of Brinksmanship, where we have one climactic encounter and we test our nerves against those of our adversary and hope that he backs down first. The picture I'm trying to paint is that the problem today is considerably more complex. Rather than a clear calculation of a single encounter, we must consider escalation and the dynamics of multiple encounters, rather than the simple 2x2 matrix, let's say from a game theoretical matrix like a prisoner's dilemma. We have many multiple unpredictable encounters or iterations, as the game theorists say, that are being thrust upon us nearly simultaneously, perhaps unexpectedly. Will the Ukrainians still follow NATO instructions, I assume NATO instructions or something very similar, to avoid the use of long-range missile attacks into Russia? Will the Ukrainians still observe that prohibition if a Russian bombing kills top leaders, including President Zelensky? How will Putin respond to a Ukrainian strike with US supplied weapons that destroy a significant part of Russia's Black Sea fleet or bases, or commando raids that assassinate top Putin allies in Moscow? What pressure from NATO countries, what pressure will come from NATO countries to escalate, to somehow respond with force if a strike on a nuclear facility, a power complex, even if it's accidental, nevertheless releases a deadly cloud of radiation that harms Western Europe as well? What kind of public pressure will enter into the calculation at that point? One final element in this potentially dangerous dynamic of escalation is that both sides have signaled their increasing determination to prevail, to win at all costs in ways that might ratchet up the stakes and make it harder to find compromise or to de-escalate. Russia has drawn multiple red lines, most recently by annexing those 4 Ukrainian territories, right? Kherson, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, and Donetsk, these 4 provinces of Ukraine, now officially claimed as Russian territory, and with it, the commitment to defend them the same way they would defend Mother Russia herself. That an attack on these newly annexed territories is an attack on Russia, which raises the stakes tremendously. It not only is a signal or a declaration to the West, but it's a commitment to the hawks, the military security hawks in Moscow, that may tie Putin's own hands, putting pressure on himself to respond should such an attack occur in accordance with what he declared the stakes would be. For their part, on the other side, both US and NATO allies have also issued various statements that increase this escalatory pressure. For example, declaring goals, long-run goals of crippling Russia for decades to come, or even of removing Putin from power, right? So that it becomes nearly an existential issue on the Russian side. So with the statements like these on both and many others you've read about and know about in the past month, we have this ratcheting effect, which makes it more difficult to back down, not only in a calm and predictable environment to find a settlement, but when things start happening unexpectedly, and again, with public pressure from multiple countries involved. So in the interest of time, maybe I've actually gone under 10 minutes. I'll cut off further comments and allow anything else to come out in discussion, just with that observation in conclusion, that this may actually, for all of our more advanced permissive action links and sophisticated controls over nuclear weapons, we've heard from Professor Zubok that maybe they're not quite as sophisticated or careful on the Russian side. And by analogy, they probably aren't, given how poorly things are managed on the conventional side. We have a situation where 60 years later, instead of having learned the lessons and being better able to manage a complex crisis, in fact, it's more dangerous than it was 60 years ago.
Well, thank you very much. Just a couple of quick comments from me, and then I want to open it to Q&A and maybe to Hans, if Hans is prepared to give us a quick comment. So just two comments from me. One is the dimension of time. And we're struck that the Cuban Missile Crisis was a crisis, time limited, had to do something about those missiles that were being deployed, being installed. When we look back, we're amazed that the XCOM could have operated for as many days as it did with really quite tight secrecy. Hard to imagine that happening these days. This crisis is not so time limited, but my question is, as the time goes on, as it spreads out, as it stretches out, it's not clear to me that time is really on our side, because time, it seems to me, does raise all the risks that both Naj and Rob were talking about. Some accident, some miscalculation, something. The other interesting comparison for me is notice that in the end, while the US did an ultimatum, it also agreed to take those missiles out of Turkey. So the questions we think about this nuclear confrontation, at least it seems we should open our minds to thinking about what we might do. What is there some conceivable sweetener? In a certain sense, it seems to me so far we've basically given the Ukrainians a kind of blank check, and don't know. It's a question we can think about and talk about whether that makes sensible policy for us. Steve, is Hans with us? Hans, are you with us and interested in making a comment? See you there. Well, come in whenever. Send us a note if you'd like to, and thank you in any case for being with us. Okay, who'd like to ask a question? We now got at least a few minutes for Q&As. Yeah, so why don't you say your name when you.
My name is Ryan. My question is mostly about the rational actor state of Putin, because I know that a lot of this versus the old Russia crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis is a lot more focused, at least in the media, on Putin himself and whether he feels the need to use the nuclear missiles, whether or not that is something the rest of the Kremlin thinks so. So I wanted to understand kind of your opinions based on intelligence and understanding of how worried should one be about how rational he's acting.
Who'd like to take a crack? President Zubok, you want to have a word about that?
One of the reasons why looking up into the stars is so significant.
Oh, can I talk now?
Yes, please.
Rational or not rational? Well, we have a bona fide from President Biden, who finds Putin absolutely rational. I'm not so optimistic about Putin's rationality, but even an ultimately sane and rational person acts, bases his acts on information he receives and on certain frameworks of analysis. So, for instance, one of the conclusions from my talk can be that on the Russian side, there are no authoritative narratives of the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, no authoritative narratives from different situations in the Cold War where Khrushchev or his successors were put in a situation when they had to consider the use of nuclear weapons. Everything is secret. and to such an extent that, sometimes even those who classify those information, they don't know where to find it. And, this is a paradox of Soviet-Russian secrecy. So, for instance, if Putin tomorrow would send someone to the Russian archives, the military or whatever, telling them, listen, guys, I heard about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't know what happened there. Would you please find information for me there? They would, I cannot guarantee what kind of information they would bring, probably very poor. I cannot guarantee what kind of report they would write for Putin, probably of the same type as they wrote on Ukraine, which convinced Putin that, hey, I want to, if I move my forces into Ukraine, Ukrainians will meet me with flowers. So that is not a question about rationality of Putin. This is a question about incredible sloppiness of information keeping, lessons learning, and that magnifies irrational decisions of Putin in this field as well. Irrational from, of course, Western rational view. Everything is in the eye of the beholder. So very important thing to remember about Putin that we read almost every day in Western newspapers and magazines. Putin prefers to double down. Every time when he loses, he prefers to double down. That's his psychological makeup. And I would take it very seriously. Khrushchev was a little bit of the same cut, but Khrushchev, unlike Putin, was a survivor of World War II. He was at Stalingrad in 1942, 43, and so on and so forth. He had that live experience, both of the extreme violence on the battlefield, I'm talking about Khrushchev, and the live experience of nuclear tests of the 50s that were on the ground, not on the ground. So Putin lacks all this experience. To what extent it can contribute to his irrationality in a sense of doubling down in the nuclear area as well, in the nuclear, in this area of when he would use nukes as the weapons of last resort. I'm worried about it, just on the same as the persons on the cartoon that Najmedin showed us.
Vlad, if, and it may be unlikely, thinking about the Cuban Missile Crisis enters at all into Putin's and his advisors' thinking about next steps today in Ukraine, is it possible that the only lesson that prevails is a kind of general, simplistic lesson that we can't be weak? We backed down last time and it cost us, right? Not lessons about escalation, about off-ramps, about openness or secrecy, about the things Professor Meshkati's talking about, but just a kind of crude, we won't back down this time because we were humiliated last time.
Rob, this is exactly what I wanted to convey to the audience, that at some point, well, there were parallel interpretations of the crisis on the Soviet side that were passed to the Russians, next generation of decision makers. Only a few, let's call them liberal-minded, who took part in the Cuban Missile Crisis conferences, were interested in this American stuff about, nuances of psychology, contingency, irrationality of actors, and so on and so forth. The majority were not interested in this thing. The majority basically said, with more luck, we would have prevailed. We would have had the missile in Cuba. And this is exactly the mentality that Putin inherited.
Thank you. Who next? Anybody want to raise a hand in the virtual world? Hans, you unmuted yourself. Can we prevail on it? You've had such rich experience around these issues. If you had a comment, that would be great.
Dr. Blix, do you hear us?
Can you see me or hear me?
Yes. Oh, now we can. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
All right. Well, I'm watching the foreign policy scene, and the question, acute question, is whether there should be talks about a ceasefire. And Putin and the Russians have clearly indicated they want it, but on what conditions? Yes, on the conditions that they will not touch the areas in which they are in control, in Luhansk and in and the three other areas. So they going into a discussion about ceasefire would mean allowing and accepting that Russia gobbles up some 20-30% of the Ukrainian territory. And this in front of an unsure threat of Russia of use of nuclear. One day say that they will not use it, and another day they say they might use it, or somebody says they will use it. I don't think one can succumb to nuclear blackmailing or rattling of the nuclear bombs, because if it's done once, then what is to stop them from half a year later coming with the same threat and always giving in? Then we would be on the slope down. So I think we have to accept that the Ukrainians are the ones who are shooting and dying for their territory, and we have to support them in that and not giving in to nuclear blackmail.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Who next? Oh, Jacques, you want to come in?
Thank you very much. This is really a fantastic panel. I can't remember who it was, but somebody was pointing out that the Cuban Missile Crisis was a simpler one than what we're facing now. And I want to push back against that a little bit. And in particular, I want to push back against the notion that the Cuban Missile Crisis was just a bipolar crisis between the US and the Soviet Union. It seems to me that the literature that has come out on the Cuban side of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is starting with some of the conferences that Vlad mentioned, has indicated very clearly that Fidel Castro and the Cubans played a very important role and a destabilizing role in that in that triangle, not only at the start, but also as late as the Cubans attempting to go up to the tribune at the United Nations and to announce that there actually were nuclear weapons in Cuba already, which was something that the Americans hadn't known. And they were stopped at the last minute by the UN ambassador of the Soviet Union. So it just seems to me that, I admit that there are lots of complications in the current crisis, but it seems to me that there were many complications in the Cuban Missile Crisis as well.
Thanks, Jacques. Next, yeah.
Well, now that Putin has acknowledged China's concerns about the invasion of Ukraine, and that the Prime Minister Modi of India has also said that there is a need for the tensions to be de-escalated, do you think that there are any chances for Russia to get persuaded by China and India of easing the tensions? Do you think that Putin will really acknowledge these preoccupations of these two strategic actors that are strategic partners for Russia? Do you think that there is a chance for that?
Rob, what's your bet?
No.
That's terse.
If you'd asked that question a month and a half ago, when the statements you're referring to from Modi, from Xi Jinping came out, and we hadn't seen the repercussions, I would have been a little more hopeful. But I think now they haven't had any effect. They may have been more for Western consumption, and that China and India are, in fact, so long as it doesn't escalate, not unhappy with the situation where they're getting cheap Russian energy because Europe's not buying any and energy markets have been disrupted, where the West, although we are very excited, we've spoken so much about NATO unity like never before. In fact, NATO has many fissures, and the economic crisis slamming Europe now may see NATO come out in the spring, on the other end, I mean, in the spring, after 3 or 4 more months, when we have strikes, when we have factory closures, when we have schools that can't be heated, when we have basically a recession of 3 or 4 point negative growth across many EU countries. That's maybe not only Putin's long game, but one that doesn't displease Xi Jinping either. And as far as India, I'm not sure of their, economic versus political alliances, but it seems that the Indian commentariat, if I can speak to that, their political and military analysts who blog, who write articles, haven't changed much in their position that a plague on both your houses. They're still reminding Americans that you invaded Iraq, killed tens of thousands of people on a false pretext. You have very selective or double standards of justice, and it's terrible what happened to Ukraine, but we remember all the things you've done, so we're going to stay a little aloof. That's what I see more of now. I was hopeful for what you said earlier, but 2 months later, it hasn't had any practical effect economically, politically, militarily.
I think I agree. This has got to, though, it's got to be uncomfortable for China, for Xi Jinping. On one hand, the Russian attack has violated all these norms that the Communist Party in China has cared about for 50 years, right? Non-intervention, sovereignty, all those things. So that's got to be uncomfortable. And then the world has drawn this kind of funny parallel between Taiwan and Ukraine, which has also got to be uncomfortable, since whatever we like, the Chinese claim to Taiwan is a lot stronger than any Russian claim to Ukraine. So it's got to be uncomfortable. But so far, as Rob says, it hasn't really resulted in much except occasional comments about how uncomfortable it makes the Chinese.
It's hard to know, but let me just give one more example, because I've been obsessively following, as Greg Treverton knows well, the Arctic and the geopolitics of the Arctic. And subsequent to those statements that you referenced, literally 3 or 4 weeks later, China, regarding the Arctic, made a statement that if Russia wasn't readmitted to the Arctic Council in effect, or the boycott of Russia didn't stop, then China would defy the Arctic Council in their Arctic activities, research, commercial, and so forth. And by the way, reminded everybody that in their opinion, the West and NATO were at fault for the Ukraine crisis. What an odd thing to add on to a statement about the Arctic. But in a way, the message was clear on 2 points. One, we still stand with Russia. Right? We're going to boycott the Arctic Council unless you readmit Russia. That's not going to have much effect, but there was the statement. And secondly, a reminder that NATO was responsible for the war in Ukraine. So why would you even say that if you were China in a completely different sphere, unless you were in a soft way or partial way, reaffirming that on the whole, you stand with Russia?
Yeah, no, I just kind of to add on to that, I think when you examine a crisis, though, you have to consider like all the angles and everything that's contributed to the crisis. And so like at the beginning of the talk, Professor Zubok said that the Cuban Missile Crisis has the accounts of the Cuban Missile Crisis have been dominated by the US and the US side. And in fact, in Cuba, they refer to it as the October Crisis, and in Russia, they refer to it as the Caribbean Crisis. But internationally, we call it the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Because the US is and what people kind of gloss over is the fact that before the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US did place missiles in Russia and in Italy and in Turkey, and those missiles were pointed at the Soviet Union, and that's something that we gloss over when we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so, even now when we look at the Ukraine crisis, again, we gloss over the fact that after the fall of the Soviet Union, I think it was Bush Sr. made a pact with Russia, with Gorbachev, saying that neither Russia nor NATO would try to incorporate the East European buffer states into their sphere of influence. And the US has not, obviously has violated, or US or NATO has not adhered to that pact. And so I feel like we have to consider, not being an apologist for Russia by any sense of, or in any way, but we do have to consider kind of every angle and how the US has contributed to this conflict, or how NATO has contributed to this conflict. And, in doing so, how we can de-escalate this conflict. And so I'm curious to hear from the panelists what you think the role of the US is in de-escalating this conflict in Ukraine right now.
Maybe I get, since we are running out of time, we could keep this up. I think we could go all afternoon, but maybe get a final comment from each of our panelists. Professor Zubok, you want to start? Sorry, Wayne, did you want to jump in? Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, very briefly, I heard what with all respect, Mr. Blix said, that we should support Ukrainians. That is, of course, the main problem that we have. We have a triangle. And, I agree with Jacques that Cubans played a role during the missile crisis, but the Cubans didn't hold the keys from the resolution of the crisis. They didn't hold the keys from the missiles and nuclear weapons. And actually, when Mikoyan came to Cuba to negotiate the solution, the resolution of the crisis, he, after talking to Castro and the other guys, he telegraphed Khrushchev, no way we can leave any of these missiles or any of these weapons in Cuba, because if Cubans have a say, we are in trouble. And we know what kind of telegram Castro sent to Cuba. Let's have a preemptive strike, which resonates with me with very awkwardly phrased Zelensky's statement about something doing before Putin along this call. So there are parallelisms. But I think the United States is in real trouble because the United States, does not have free hands. Somebody mentioned blank check. This is exactly what it is. And we know how blank check works. It worked disastrously in August 1914, when the First World War was unleashed. And it may work quite unpredictably now. Okay, if the United States decide to continue with a blank check and support brave Ukrainians in whatever they do, we are into the dangerous period of brinkmanship. Are we prepared for it? We should better be.
Thank you very much. Wayne, a quick comment?
Well, thanks very much to the panel for your outstanding analyses. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I don't know if there's time, but my quick question would be, what happens if Russia becomes desperate and uses smaller nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons? What's the best next step for the supporters of Ukraine? And thanks again for an outstanding panel.
Nash, a final comment?
Wayne, thank you very much, but I'm the least qualified person among these three.
We'll have Rob next.
I'll be very brief.
Answer that question.
From what we know, what we seem to know unofficially is that the United States, our diplomats, right, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and aides to President Biden are trying to communicate that they would not necessarily respond with a nuclear weapon to a Russian tactical strike or demonstration. It could be that kind of use of a tactical weapon. Rather, they say we have a whole menu of conventional options, but they would be devastating to Russia. They would not only involve tougher sanctions and isolation that will cripple Russia, but they could attack. In other words, we could conventionally strike at Russian forces in Ukraine, in the Black Sea. We don't have to go nuclear to do unacceptable damage. And so that's trying to find a fine line where we can respond. We will not back down to your brinksmanship, your saber rattling, but neither will we go nuclear automatically if you do. And so we don't necessarily enter that nuclear spiral of escalation, which could lead to general nuclear war quickly. That's what the Biden administration is trying to do. And most moderate centrist experts seem to give them a lot of credit for that as a middle ground.
Great. Thank you.
If I
Nash,
can
final
add-
word, last word.
Yeah, just one more comment to what Professor English said. When there was a commentary by Joe Cirincione published in Washington Post, and then he talked more about that. I think he tries to address this question that you ask, and if you don't have it, I will email it to you. That it came out in Washington Post 3 weeks ago. My last word is what I said as part of my talk. If you remember at the beginning of my talk, I said, I learned that in the case of several cases like Miracle on Hudson, you know about Captain Sully Sullenberger, Fukushima Daini. We studied that human operators were first and last layer of defense, and they are really society's last barrier for a disaster. I think what Vasily Arkhipov did was really, he did it. But we don't know that we will have the same luck in the future. I remember a line by the Nobel physicist Richard Feynman in his presidential, in the comment in the presidential report about Challenger accident. Feynman had a beautiful line, the Nobel physicist. He said, quote, when playing Russian roulette, the first shot got off safely is no guarantee for the next one, on the end of the quote. Dealing with these nuclear weapons in the time of a standoff, we are playing Russian roulette. We got safe time for the first time, or one time here in the case of a Cuban missile crisis, but they could not be the second time. Thank you.
Ominous way to end it, but I'm afraid we must. Thanks to everybody,
Thank you.
particularly thanks to all the participants. Special thanks to our panelists, particularly Professor Zubok, who's joining us from Europe. It's been a great conversation. We could continue all afternoon, but we won't. For those of you in the room to pick up a lunch if you'd like on your way out. And again, thanks to all our participants, both physical and virtual.
Thank you.